Hello and welcome to the Storm of Scripture. I'm Jeff Johnson, and today we are going to have the first of two lessons in the Christianity Q&A series. This lesson will begin to answer the question, must the temple be rebuilt before Christ returns? I worded this question carefully. The question is not, will the temple be rebuilt before Christ returns, but must it? Is there a constraint on the return of Christ that as long as the temple remains a mosque in Jerusalem, that Christ will not return? This is one specific way of looking at it. A broader question might be, must the temple be rebuilt before certain prophecies in Scripture are fulfilled? Many prophetic interpretations key a rapture to the rebuilding of the temple as well. And so the timing of several elements of prophetic interpretation seem to be keyed off of the temple's rebuilding. And some people's reaction to the escalating violence in the Middle East has to do with their picture as to whether this temple needs to be rebuilt, and as a corollary, whether the nation of Israel needs to control the Temple Mount in order to make that happen. As we look at the Scriptures to answer this question, we'll be pulling from passages in Ezekiel, Daniel, Matthew, 2 Thessalonians, and of course Revelation. I thank you for joining me as we examine the Scriptures for the answer to the question, must the temple be rebuilt before Christ returns? The question that I hope to help answer today is, must the temple be rebuilt before Christ returns? Now, let me begin by saying there are sincere, studious, wise scholars on both sides of this issue. Ones that would answer this question with a yes, and ones that would answer this question with a no. This tells me one main thing. It is not a salvation issue to answer this question correctly. There are some times when it is a salvation issue to answer the question correctly. Is Jesus the Son of God? For instance, very important question to answer correctly. But whether the temple should be rebuilt or not, I do not think we have to have the right answer to be saved. So let me just start there. I am going to present as best I can both sides of this answer, both sides of the issue, people from scholars who answer both yes and also no. And I've identified four main passages. How do we interpret this passage gives us the answer to the question about rebuilding the temple. We will start in sort of biblical order, and so that takes us first to the book of Ezekiel. In chapters 40 through the end of Ezekiel, basically, there are descriptions of a temple that Ezekiel has in a vision. He has a vision of a temple. If you'll remember, Ezekiel is an exiled prophet. He started off in Jerusalem, but was taken along with others out of Israel into exile in Babylon when Babylon invaded. So he is in exile when he sees this vision of this temple. And he describes it in great detail, chapters of description of a future temple, because the current temple in Ezekiel's day is destroyed while he's in exile. So let's read this passage, just one little piece of this protracted description of the future temple in chapter 43, verses 4 through 7. And then the glory of Yahweh came to the temple, this is Ezekiel's visionary temple, by way of the gate facing east. And the Spirit lifted me, and it brought me to the inner courtyard. And look, the glory of Yahweh filled the temple. And I heard someone speaking to me from the house, and a man was standing beside me. And he said to me, Son of man, this is the place of my throne and the place for the soles of my feet, where I will dwell in the midst of the Israelites to eternity. And they, the house of Israel, they and their kings, will not again defile my holy name, with their fornication and with their offerings for the dead of their kings or their high places. This is a vision of a future temple. We could think it's a vision of the second temple, the temple that's initially rebuilt by Ezra and Nehemiah, and then expanded greatly by Herod, perhaps. But that isn't really fitting for the whole context of this vision. Talking about eternity and how they will never again defile his holy name and all of these sort of ultimate comments makes every interpreter think that Ezekiel is having a vision that applies to the very end, to the ultimate goal of God, not necessarily the second temple that's rebuilt by Ezra and Nehemiah, which never really experiences the kind of the glory of Yahweh filling the temple as is described here. We have a scene when Solomon builds his temple of the glory filling the temple so that you could not even enter into the temple because of the glory. And if you just take the physical dimensions that Ezekiel applies to all these different things, it's much bigger than the second temple. Even Herod's temple was ever built. So it doesn't that doesn't fit the description of Ezekiel. Even if we consider Herod's temple, which was bigger than Ezra and Nehemiah's, it's just not big enough. Ezekiel describes a temple complex that is the size of at least 2 football fields long and wide. It's gigantic. No temple complex is that big, at least not in Ezekiel's day or in the first century. If it is, though, a future temple of the end of times, what are we talking about? Well, the people who interpret this as applying to a temple to say this is it. Ezekiel is describing that temple that will be built before Christ comes. This is a quotation from the New American Commentary on Ezekiel. I have several volumes of the New American Commentary, and I use them. Like I said, these are scholarly people. They engage seriously with the text, and he answers, yes, the temple must be rebuilt. And he says this: in these visions of chapters 40 through the end of the book, he, Ezekiel, also saw a future day when Israel will witness to the Messiah's salvation during the time of tribulation. The rebuilt temple will afford an opportunity for Israel to realize and practice its missionary purpose in the plan of God and practice the symbols of their covenant for the first time, in retrospect, to commemorate the redemptive work of Jesus as Messiah. Part of this description of the temple that Ezekiel gives includes a description of animal sacrifice. This explanation says they will be performing those animal sacrifices in commemoration of Jesus' sacrifice. So Jesus was the ultimate sacrifice, but when the Jews rebuild their temple, they will be commemorating through the sacrificial system what Christ did on the cross. That the Jews of the future who are in this time of tribulation will be practicing this sacrificial system in honor of Christ. Yes, that's what he's suggesting. And there are multiple interpretive stances even within the yes-no big answer to this question. But this is his. I believe this Cooper, who wrote this New American Commentary, he asserts that this temple isn't going to be rebuilt until the tribulation begins. Even if they were to rebuild a temple like today, if the tribulation hadn't started, this wasn't the temple that he's talking about. This is temple built by, and again, I'm kind of talking outside of my own point of view, but I believe he would say this temple is the one built by the 144,000 Israelites, or Jews that are identified there. So they are already faithful, but they're rebuilding a temple in order to honor Christ. Let me point out the no answer on Ezekiel's vision. First quote is from author of a book called Heaven on Earth, the Temple and Biblical Theology. He says, the movement in the progressive revelation of Scripture is always from the lesser to the greater. It's never reversed. Christians, therefore, who advocate the rebuilding of the temple are regressing into a pre-Christian sacrificial system, superseded and annulled by the finished work of Jesus Christ. His point is that Jesus did away with the sacrificial system. There's no need for it any longer. So to go back to that is a regression. It's a move backwards. And this is not the path of the revelation of God. He always is moving us forward to the next better thing. Jesus was the best thing, and therefore there is absolutely no need and no theological justification for restoring a sacrificial system.
But the Jews don't believe that today.
Well, they don't think that Jesus is the Messiah, so they don't.
So they're going to try to
So they could, yes, they want that sacrificial system back. Those, at least Orthodox Jews do, as they say that that's the only way to fulfill Torah is to do that. Our answer is no. You can fulfill Torah by being faithful to Christ, because he fulfilled the Torah. Let me also point out that Luther, and this quote was taken from a commentary called A Commentary on the Holy Scriptures, a volume on Ezekiel, but Luther said, the building of Ezekiel's is not to be understood of a new material building, but is nothing else than the kingdom of Christ, the holy church of Christendom, here on earth, even to the last day. So Luther's position was that this is a symbolic description. This is a metaphor for the church, an extended multi-chapter metaphor of various ways. And the longer quote from Luther, he talks about how we don't know what every single piece of this metaphor might mean, but it's not a physical temple. And one of the points made by Alexander there in Heaven and Earth, a Temple in Biblical Theology, and by other theologians in that line is that when Ezekiel describes this temple, he describes guilt offerings and burnt offerings. He does describe that. In Ezekiel 40, verse 39, he says, in the vestibule of the gate were 2 tables on either side, on which the burnt offering and the sin offering and the guilt offering were to be slaughtered. So in Ezekiel's vision, animal sacrifice is a part of that temple. And so if you take it as a literal description of some eschatological temple, a temple of the tribulation or something of that nature, sin offerings are being offered. And they are included in this vision that God has given Ezekiel. So therefore they have to be legitimate. That's the hoops to get through to say, okay, well then they're doing the animal sacrifice, so they have to be doing them for some legitimate reason. So the legitimate reason is to commemorate Jesus' sacrifice. But Ezekiel doesn't present that as a commemoration at all. He's just saying they're doing the whole thing again. Now, if we interpret Ezekiel's vision of the temple metaphorically, as Luther does and many others, we can say that the animal sacrificial system is included in Jesus' own sacrifice, because he was the burnt offering. He was the whole burnt offering. He was the sin offering, the guilt offering in himself. So these descriptions of sin offerings as part of the temple experience are metaphorically interpreted as Christ's sacrifice for us. So we can see Christ in those sacrifices just as we see them in Leviticus as being images and foreshadowing of Christ. So they are in this vision of Ezekiel a incorporation of how Christ fulfilled those sacrifices in himself. And so the temple of the church includes them through Christ. One of the theological requirements of the temple being rebuilt along with the sacrificial system occurring, and the sacrificial system that it occurs is also an essential part of the picture of a temple coming. Not just from Ezekiel, but in Daniel 9, 26 and 27, Daniel says, after the 62 weeks, an anointed one shall be cut off, and he shall have nothing, and the people of the coming leader will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and its end will be with the flood, and on to the end there will be war. Those desolations are determined. And he will make a strong covenant with many for 1 week, but in half of the week he will let cease sacrifice and offering, and in its place a desolating abomination comes, even until the determined complete destruction is poured out on the desolator. In this passage, there is a sanctuary, and there is offering that's cut off in the middle of the week. So those who say, yes, there must be a temple rebuilt, say that this needs to be literally fulfilled in the end times. An example of that would be from Walvoord, Walvoord. I'm not sure if I'm saying his name correctly, but he's written extensively, and he's cited by a lot of commentaries for his interpretation this way. He says the last 7-year period will begin after the rapture of the church, which will consummate God's program in this present age. The Antichrist will end sacrifice and offering. This expression refers to the entire Levitical system, which suggests that Israel will have restored that system in the first half of the 70th seven. So there's the keeping with this picture that the temple of Ezekiel is doing animal sacrifice. Well, those who see Daniel the same way say that that's what's happening. They're doing the whole sacrificial system. Then Daniel was told that the ruler who will come will place abominations on a wing of the temple. Christ referred to this incident. You will see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, from Matthew 24:15. This idea that the temple must be rebuilt because Daniel says at the end of time there's going to be a temple and halfway through is going to be destroyed, and Jesus echoes it. It's one of the key things of this interpretation that says, yes, the temple must be rebuilt, is the idea that Jesus' comments in Matthew 24 are equated with Daniel's description in Daniel 9. They are talking about the same thing in both of those contexts. Now, those who say, no, it's not necessarily going to be rebuilt, will say this. This is actually Josephus writing in the 1st century, contemporary with the time of Christ, or shortly thereafter. He says this. And Daniel wrote that from among them, the kings represented by the beasts in the vision, among them, that's when he says what he means by them, there should arise a certain king that should overcome our nation and their laws, and should take away our political government, and should spoil the temple, and forbid the sacrifices to be offered for 3 years' time. And indeed, it so came to pass that our nation suffered these things under Antiochus Epiphanes, according to Daniel's vision, and what he wrote many years after they came to pass. And in the very same manner, Daniel also wrote concerning the Roman government, and that our country should be made desolate by them. So Josephus says Daniel's prediction was about Antiochus Epiphanes and the destruction of the temple at that time, but applies to also the destruction of the temple in his own day by the Romans, so that Daniel was writing about sort of both of these things at the same time. This view that Daniel's prophecy was primarily about Antiochus Epiphanes, but secondarily about the destruction of temple in 70 AD, was adopted by many Christian interpreters in the first couple of centuries after Christ. This was the default understanding. It was about the destruction by Antiochus and the destruction in 70 AD. We get down to Matthew 24:15 and 16. This is what was cited just in that quote in the commentator. Jesus did say in his Olivet discourse, so when you see the abomination of desolation spoken about by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the one who reads understand, then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. So if Jesus is talking about end times, this is an affirmation that the temple has to be there, because there couldn't be a holy place to have an abomination if there's no temple. So it has to be there. This commentator from the Holman New Testament commentary on Matthew, he says, although the AD 70 abomination was almost certainly in Jesus' mind, remember that's after Jesus' day, so he's saying yes, Jesus was thinking about that 70 AD event. But he says both he and Daniel looked ahead to another such abomination in the temple, which is yet future to us. This implied, of course, that the temple will again be rebuilt on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, where the Muslim Dome of the Rock has stood for the last 13 centuries. Of course, the fact that Israel has reestablished itself as a national political entity and occupied the Holy Temple site again has many scholars anticipating the end times very soon. This is very true, and that has become no less true since he wrote that commentary several years ago. So the yes answer is that Daniel, Jesus' comments in Matthew, both are talking about, could be talking about Antiochus, are talking about 70 AD, and also talking about the future time when Jesus ultimately returns. Now, those who say no, the temple doesn't have to be rebuilt, basically say that the Daniel's prophecy and Jesus' comments in Matthew are more or less completely fulfilled in either the days of Antiochus or the days of 70 AD. And they are not primarily or even directly about Jesus' second coming. So this is N.T. Wright's version. He comments in a book called The New Testament in Its World. The terrifying warnings are sustained through the Olivet Discourse in all three versions, in Mark, Matthew, and Luke, which uses end-of-the-world language to demonstrate that with the fall of Jerusalem and with the destruction of the temple, a world, the socio-political world of the first century Judean life, is coming to an end. So they interpret those things as fulfilled in 70 AD. This other commentary, Carson from the Expositor's Bible Commentary, he says, the instructions Jesus gives to his disciples about what to do in view of verse 15 are so specific that they must be related to the Jewish war. The devastation would stretch far beyond the city. People throughout Judea should flee to the mountains where the Maccabeans had hidden in caves. That Maccabeans there is also a reference back to Antiochus. And then he says that there are just such specific details about what to do when you see this happening that they just have to be related to the historical event in 70 AD. They don't apply to the worldwide return of Christ. I have two more passages, the 2 Thessalonians passage and one from Revelation, so we can continue the conversation next week.
Thank you for joining me today as we look at this controversial question about the rebuilding of the temple. Let me say at this point, I do not believe that agreement on this question is necessary for salvation. If you do disagree, please feel free to comment here in YouTube or over in the Storm of Scripture discussion group in Facebook. You could also email me directly. I'll be glad to have a private conversation with you by email at storeroomofscripture@comcast.net. We will finish our look at the Scriptures and some early Christian literature regarding the same question next week here at the Storm of Scripture. Until then, I look forward to our time together when we will examine the treasures in the biblical text.